Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at this idea of data sheets for datasets. You know how important data is these days, especially with all the talk about AI and machine learning? Well, we're going even deeper today, looking at the data behind the data.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating concept, right? We're going to be diving into a research paper from 2018 called Datasheets for Datasets. It was written by Timnit Gebru and some other folks, and it basically argues that just like, when you buy a new electronic component, it comes with a datasheet that tells you all about its specifications and how to use it safely and effectively.
Right.
Well, they're saying we should have the same thing for datasets, like a detailed documentation package that lays out everything you need to know about the data itself.
I love that analogy. It's so true. We often get caught up in the excitement of AI models and all the amazing things they can do, but we don't always stop to think critically about the data that's fueling those models. It's like we're so focused on the car that we forget to check what kind of fuel we're putting in the tank.
Exactly. And the thing is, the characteristics of a data set can have a huge impact on how an AI model behaves. And this becomes especially important in fields like, let's say, criminal justice or hiring or finance.
Oh, absolutely. High stakes areas.
Yeah, where the decisions made by these AI systems can have real-world consequences for people's lives.
You start to realize that data isn't just some neutral set of numbers. It carries all sorts of baggage with it, right?
It definitely does, and that's exactly what Datasheets for Datasets is trying to address. They propose a standardized way to document datasets, sort of like a comprehensive guide for both the people who create these datasets and the people who use them.
So like a common language for talking about data.
Yeah, exactly. So you know what to expect and how to use the data responsibly.
Okay, I'm sold. But what kind of information would these data sheets actually contain? Like, what are some of the key questions they're trying to answer?
Well, they delve into various aspects of a dataset's lifecycle, starting with the motivation behind its creation. Why was this dataset created in the first place? What purpose does it serve? Who funded it? All of these initial factors can potentially influence the data itself.
I see what you mean. It's like understanding the context, right?
Right. Then the datasheet moves on to the composition of the dataset itself. What types of data points does it contain? How many are there? Are there any gaps or inconsistencies in the data? It's all about getting a really clear picture of what this data set is made of, almost like an ingredient list for data.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're not just blindly throwing data into a model. We're actually understanding what we're working with.
Precisely. And then we get to the really important part, the collection process. How was the data gathered? What tools or methods were used? Were there any ethical considerations taken into account, especially if the data involves personal information about people?
Oh, that's so crucial, especially these days when data privacy is such a big concern.
Absolutely. And the data sheet goes even further than that. It also covers how the data was processed, cleaned, and labeled, what software was used, were there any errors discovered along the way. It's like a complete audit trail showing the journey the data took from its raw form to the finished data set.
Okay, so we're seeing the whole picture here. We're not just getting the final product. We're understanding all the steps that went into creating it.
Right. Then there's a section on uses, which is all about outlining what tasks this data set is suitable for. And just as importantly, are there any tasks it definitely should not be used for? This helps establish clear guidelines for responsible application.
It's like a warning label on a product, right?
Yeah.
Use only as directed.
Haha, exactly. And of course, there's a section on how the dataset will be shared and distributed, what license or terms of use apply, are there any restrictions on who can access it?
So responsible sharing and accessibility too.
Right. And finally, the datasheet addresses the issue of maintenance. Who's responsible for looking after this data set? Will it be updated? How will any changes be communicated to the people who are using it?
I never would have thought of that, but it
Yeah.
makes total sense. Data can change over time, and we need a way to keep track of those changes. So it sounds like these data sheets are incredibly comprehensive. But I'm curious, do we have any real-world examples of them in action? I'd love to see how all these questions are actually answered in practice.
As a matter of fact, the researchers included an example datasheet in the paper. They applied their framework to Pang and Lee's polarity dataset, which is a collection of movie reviews often used for sentiment analysis.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. I've actually heard of that data set before. What did the data sheet reveal about it?
Well, one of the things that jumped out at me was that even with a seemingly straightforward dataset like that, just movie reviews, right?
Hmm.
There can be gaps in our understanding of the data. Even the authors of the datasheet couldn't find the answers to every single question they posed.
That's a little surprising to hear. I guess it shows how much we take data for granted sometimes. without really understanding its origins or the decisions that went into shaping it.
Exactly. And this particular example also highlights some of the ethical considerations that can arise when working with data about people. Even something as simple as a movie review can raise questions about consent and privacy. So, for example, in the collection process section of the datasheet, there's a question about whether the people who wrote those movie reviews were ever notified that their data was being collected,
Oh, interesting.
or if they gave consent for it to be used in this way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And since the data was scraped from public online forums, the datasheet authors couldn't definitively answer that question.
That makes you think, huh, just because something is publicly available online, does that automatically mean people are okay with it being used for research or for training AI models? It's a bit of a gray area, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where these data sheets can be really valuable, I think. They force us to confront those tricky ethical questions and think more carefully about the data we're using.
Right, it's not just a bunch of numbers. These are real people and their opinions, even if they're just talking about movies.
Exactly. The movie review dataset also highlighted how even seemingly objective data can involve a certain degree of subjective interpretation.
Hmm. Oh, so?
Well, the dataset relies on a star rating system to indicate sentiment.
Right.
But how do you translate those ratings into a simple positive or negative label? Like, what about a 3-star review?
Yeah, that can mean different things to different people.
Exactly. So the datasheet explains how the researchers made those decisions.
Okay.
They considered anything 4 stars or above to be positive and anything 2 stars or below to be negative, and they just excluded the 3-star reviews altogether.
I see, so they had to draw a line somewhere. But even that decision, that seemingly minor choice about where to draw the line, could potentially influence the results of any analysis done using that data, right?
Right. It's an important detail to document so that anyone using the data set can understand those nuances and interpret the results accordingly.
Makes sense. And I'm also curious about the section on uses. I remember you mentioned that the datasheet cautioned against using the movie review dataset for certain tasks. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So the thing is, this particular data set was specifically created for sentiment analysis. The way the data was collected, the way it was pre-processed and labeled, it was all done with that goal in mind.
Okay.
So if you were to use it for something else entirely, like, say, trying to predict box office success,
Right.
you might end up with inaccurate or misleading results. It's like trying to use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail.
It's the wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. So the data sheet helps to ensure that the data set is being used appropriately for its intended purpose.
So it's really about encouraging people to be more intentional and thoughtful in how they're using data. Now, I'm curious, beyond this one example, what kind of impact has the data sheets for data sets idea had in the real world? Has it gained any traction?
Actually, it has. In the paper itself, the authors mention that organizations like Microsoft, Google, and IBM have all started experimenting with data sheets internally.
Oh, wow, that's great to hear. So the big players are taking notice.
Yeah, it seems like there's a growing recognition that we need better documentation and transparency around data, especially as AI becomes more and more prevalent in our lives.
It's not just about the fancy algorithms anymore. It's about understanding where the data comes from and what we're doing with it.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to data sets either. Google AI, for instance, has developed something called model cards.
Model cards.
Yeah, they're essentially data sheets, but for machine learning models. So instead of just documenting the data, they provide information about the AI models themselves.
Okay, like a user manual for an AI.
In a way, yes. They give you a comprehensive overview of the model, including things like its architecture, the data it was trained on, what it's intended to be used for, how it performs on different metrics, even potential ethical considerations.
It's like lifting the hood and seeing how the engine works.
Exactly. And the Partnership on AI, which is this big multi-stakeholder organization focused on responsible AI development, has also been working on industry-wide documentation guidelines that build on these ideas of data sheets and model cards.
So it's becoming more of a collaborative effort. That's great to see.
Yeah, it's encouraging to see people coming together from different sectors and different backgrounds to address these really important issues around data and AI.
It really does feel like we're at a turning point. There's a growing awareness that AI development isn't just about the technical aspects, it's about the societal impact as well.
Definitely. We can't just focus on building powerful AI systems. We also need to be thinking about the ethical implications and about how to use these systems in a way that benefits everyone.
I totally agree. But, even with all the progress that's being made, the authors of Datasheets for Datasets do acknowledge that there are some limitations to this approach. They're not suggesting that data sheets are a magic solution that will solve all our problems.
Right, they're not a silver bullet. I mean, for one thing, you can't possibly anticipate every single way that a data set might be used, right? Someone could take a data set that was created with the best of intentions and use it for something completely different, something that the creators never intended.
That's a scary thought.
And even with the most detailed documentation, it can still be difficult to identify and address all potential biases.
Yeah, bias can be sneaky.
It can be deeply embedded in the data itself, and sometimes it takes specialized expertise to even recognize it.
So it's not just about filling out a form, it's about ongoing critical thinking and collaboration.
Right. It's about bringing together people from different disciplines, people with different perspectives and expertise to make sure we're using data responsibly and ethically.
I love that. It's not just a technical challenge, it's a human challenge.
Yeah.
Well, this conversation has definitely given me a lot to think about. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the power of data and the importance of understanding where it comes from and how it's being used, especially in this age of AI.
Me too. It's been a great discussion.
This whole deep dive has got me thinking, we've been talking about data sheets for data sets, but could we take this idea even further?
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, we've seen how valuable it is to have this kind of documentation for the data sets themselves. But what if we applied this same concept to, the algorithms themselves?
Interesting.
Or even, the actual code that these AI systems are built on?
I see where you're going with this, like data sheets for algorithms or data sheets for code.
Yeah, exactly.
Even like data sheets for the entire AI pipeline. That would be amazing.
Right.
Documenting every single step of the process from how the problem is initially defined all the way to how the final AI system is actually put into use and then how it's monitored over time.
It's like creating a chain of custody almost for
Oh.
AI. You could trace the lineage of a system, see all the decisions that were made at each stage, and maybe identify any potential points of failure or bias along the way.
Precisely. It brings so much more transparency and accountability to the whole field of AI development.
And that could go a long way toward building trust with the public too, right?
Mm.
If people can actually understand how these systems are built and where the potential risks might lie.
Exactly. It's about making AI less of a black box and more of an open book.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it sounds like we're talking about a pretty radical shift in how we approach AI development. But is it even possible?
I think it's definitely achievable. It'll take time and effort and collaboration across a lot of different stakeholders.
Of course, it's never easy to change the way things are done, but I think the potential benefits are huge.
I agree. Well, this deep dive has been a really fascinating exploration of these ideas. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nuts and bolts of data sheets for data sets to these broader questions about the future of AI development.
Yeah, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but I've learned so much. I hope our listeners have too.
I hope so. If there's just one thing I want people to take away from this deep dive, it's that responsible AI starts with responsible data. And data sheets are a powerful tool for promoting that responsibility, but it's ultimately about creating a culture of awareness, thoughtfulness, and a commitment to ethical practices in everything we do with AI. If we can do that, then I think we can really unlock the full potential of this technology and create a better future for everyone. Thanks for listening.